looking for a game that doesn't last you a bajillion hours, something a little bit smaller scale, not a massive open world, but just a good linear adventure? Well, today we're talking about 20 linear single-player games from throughout 2024, new and upcoming. We got a bunch of games, so let's just jump in with number 20. We're starting with an obvious. It's the upcoming release of the Silent Hill 2 remake. If you know anything about Silent Hill, it's a survival horror game, and with that comes a fair amount of linearity. Sure, you can wander the foggy streets of Silent Hill, but ultimately, if it's anything like the original game, it's a fairly linear adventure. At the time of making this video, we still haven't seen this game. We're really hoping for the best because we love classic Silent Hill. Hopefully they don't screw it up here, but if they do nail it, if they do knock it out of the park and successfully remake this original game, chances are you'll have a good solid linear adventure to play through. From beginning to end, it's over. You're not doing endless side quests. That's it. It's just cool. Again, I'm still not sure about this one, but I really hope Bloober Team knocks it out of the park. Next, over at number 19, we have Children of the Sun. This is a Devolver Digital published game, and from that, you should know it's something different. It's something unique. It's a sniping game. It's all about running around the outside of your enemy camp, finding the perfect angle, and taking the shot on your enemies. Here, it's all about flawless execution, but there's really fun mechanics added, like how you can control the bullet. Essentially, it's more of a puzzle game than a shooter, but it's got a lot of style, and it's really cool. And it's essentially structured in levels, so it's a linear thing you play through. But if you grew up playing games where you would choose the sniper rifle, or maybe you played the silent scope games, Children of the Sun is a really different, unique, kind of indie style artsy spin on those concepts. And because of that, it's absolutely awesome. Next, over at number 18, we have Black Myth Wukong. I will chalk this one up on the list of sort of, kind of linear. Either way, Black Myth Wukong is an absolutely fantastic action-adventure game with cool combat, really compelling boss battles, and an incredible visual style. It's also a very straightforward game. It is level-based. You play through a level, you finish it, you move on to the next area, so that by definition is linear most of the time. Black Myth Wukong definitely opens up after about the third act, and these levels go from tight corridor hallway levels, glorified worlds, to absolutely massive, more expansive, explorable areas. Still, there are diversions in these areas, there are optional bosses and stuff like that. It's still, in my mind, a linear game. Either way, it doesn't matter. It's absolutely an awesome one. Next, over at number 17, we have Neva. This is the next game from the people behind Gris, a really interesting, simple 2D adventure that had beautiful art and music. Neva seems to be taking it a step further, adding combat and animal combat that seemingly grows with you along the adventure and is probably all going to make us cry at one point. We don't know how open this game is. It does seem from previews that it is going to be a fairly linear adventure. You just play through and finish, and that's refreshing. We'll know for sure when Neva releases October 15th. Next, over at number 16, we have Kunitsugami, Path of the Goddess. Now, if you like Capcom games, I'd say definitely take a peek at this one because they did something totally different. Instead of doing another big, expansive, big budget game, Kunitsugami Path of the Goddess is kind of a tower defense game. There's a lot more to it than that, like you have more agency as a player and as a character, but it's just really unique, surprisingly addictive, and fun. Along with that, you're playing through levels. It's not a massive, expansive thing. It's just a good, straightforward adventure that can sometimes get pretty challenging as well. Next, over at number 15, we have Luigi's Mansion 2 HD. This released for Nintendo Switch earlier this year, and it's a re-release of an incredible game. Luigi's Mansion games are really underrated by some. They're just a blast, and Luigi's Mansion 2 continues that. Granted, it is a HD re-release of a game from a handheld platform, so there are some shortcomings, but this, more than any game on the list, is just a good old-fashioned video game. Now, next, over at number 14, if we are talking about good old-fashioned video games, we have to mention Astrobot. Astrobot is a platformer where you jump into levels and you play through those levels and finish them in a linear fashion. Granted, you do have some choice as to which planet or which level you engage in. It's up to you in terms of like what order you want to tackle all these levels. But ultimately, the game is structured in kind of like little nebulas where you go through, you clear out all the planets, you fight the boss, then you move on to the next cluster of of planets. And we think it's one of the more fun, simple, charming games released this year. Next, over at number 13, we have Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. This is by Machine Games, the people behind the Wolfenstein games, which are very, very linear, and they've been upfront about Indiana Jones being a pretty linear experience as well. There's going to be some hub areas and some semi-explorable areas, but ultimately, you're going through an Indiana Jones video game adventure. I really hope they nail this one because there was a time when Indiana Jones had a bunch of cool video games. So I hope we can go back to that time. If anything, this kind of reminds me of Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay. That's kind of a deep cut, but some of you older players will definitely know what I'm talking about. Some of the people involved were involved in that game, and this could be potentially very cool and very good for Indiana Jones fans. Next, over at number 12, we have Indica, which is a really fascinating adventure. So you play as a nun in a kind of alternate industrialist Russia timeline, and you essentially venture through a spooky frozen land. There's a lot more to it than that. There's some story here, and it's kind of like a mix between like a simple adventure, maybe borderline walking simulator with some good shakeups, as well as puzzle solving, because Indica is cursed with kind of having a literal devil on her shoulder, meaning she was kind of shunned by her convent and given a mission to go out into the world. It's so weird and quirky. It's incredibly unique from the presentation to just the setup, and it's not an open world adventure that's going to take you 80 hours. Next, over at number 11, we have another remake. It's The Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons. This game from Hazelight, the people behind It Takes Two, the Game of the Year winner from a few years back. This is kind of like their humble beginnings where you play as two brothers. You control both of them with the joysticks on your controller. And it's a really good game, I think, because it doesn't outstay its welcome. You can finish it in like 3-4 hours, and it's just like a well-crafted, well-paced thing. The re-release this year didn't get a ton of traction online, but we're glad the game is available for modern platforms. It's a really cool linear game to play through. Next, over at number 10, we have Call of Duty Black Ops 6, specifically the campaign. While you're probably going to have some degree of freedom in terms of choosing what to encounter next, it's a first-person shooter campaign, so by definition, it's probably going to be fairly linear, but we're really looking forward to it. The Black Ops campaigns, when they have campaigns, definitely deliver. They go a little bit more experimental, a little bit stranger, and we think that this one is probably going to continue that trend. The Cold War campaign did some really interesting things, and we're hoping to see that continued here. Next, over at number 9, we have A Quiet Place: The Road Ahead. We don't have movie tie-in games as often as we used to, and now, a lot of the times when they release, they're actually pretty decent. And with A Quiet Place: The Road Ahead, it's being published by Saber Interactive, who've had a couple of good hits lately. I think they know what they're doing most of the time. And this is a first-person adventure in the world of The Quiet Place. It's a survivor game. You're trying to survive in a world invaded by deadly otherworldly creatures that are attracted to sound. So from what we can see here, it seems like you're using a lot of the tricks from the movies to stay silent, to get around safely. It's not about killing these monsters, it's about sneaking around them. It's about finding objects and tricks in the environment to outwit and adapt and survive. I don't know, I hope it's really good. I think Quiet Place is a really good, interesting franchise, and a video game version could be pretty cool and really help establish a little bit more of this post-apocalyptic world. We'll know for sure when it releases October 17th. Next, over at number 8, we have Still Wakes the Deep. This is a first-person adventure that takes place on an oil rig in Scotland in the 70s. A very unique setting for a very cool, weird, strange horror game. You have some agency as a player, but I would say gameplay-wise, it's pretty straightforward. It's called, by the developers, an immersive disaster story. It's hard not to talk about this one without spoiling anything, but it is an incredibly unique and creepy experience. I'd say it's definitely different from other things you've played this year, and certainly one of the more unique horror experiences on this list. It's linear, it's straightforward, it's pretty linear, there are some distractions, but really you can finish it in like 4 or 5 hours. Next, over at number 7, we have the recently released Plucky Squire, a creative spin on action-adventure platforming, thanks to its art style, its visual style. The way it genuinely feels here like these 2D, fun, quirky storybook characters can jump out of that book and continue adventuring. It's a really, really cool idea, and it seems to be resonating with people, especially if you're still in touch with your inner child. Here, it's a pretty linear game you progress through, and while there are some secret paths and stuff like that, it could take you probably like 7, 8, 9 hours. Next over at number 6, we have the Until Dawn remake. This game is completely rebuilt in Unreal Engine 5. It's a game I really enjoyed upon release. I actually remember doing the before you buy for it way back when. I'm like 100 years old now, but it's a game that I never expected to see a remake, but here we are. It's got support for modern features, obviously better visuals, and it's just a really good, fun horror adventure that wears its influences on its sleeves. It is all about choice, it is all about timing these events, but still, it is like a playable movie you progress through. So yeah, I'd say it's linear. I don't know how the remake will turn out, but either way, Until Dawn is worth playing. We'll know whether or not the remake is good when it releases October 4th of this year. Next over at number 5, speaking of remakes, we have the Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster. Now, this one, in terms of it being a linear game, is a little tricky. I might be cheating here because it has a fully explorable mall with main missions, side missions, but the whole thing is structured around a deadline. You have 72 hours in this mall to explore its secrets, save as many survivors as you can, tackle sub-objectives and optional bosses, and yeah man, it's really cool. The remake definitely has some issues. I pointed them out in my before you buy. If you're a diehard fan, you might have some nitpicks, but either way, Dead Rising is just a game worth playing in general, and yeah, I'll say that having that 72-hour deadline, having a time limit to you finishing everything because you need to get on the helicopter to escape, sort of. It's just a really cool, unique, straightforward structure to a zombie game that you wouldn't really expect. Now, next over at number 4, we're sticking with horror with Alone in the Dark. Yes, the Alone in the Dark reboot, or whatever you want to call it, did release earlier this year. It's kind of like a new creative imagining of the original game, set in the Dorsetto Mansion with Edward Carnby. And unfortunately, it does fall a little short. It has a lot of creative elements and some cool level design, but ultimately, I was a bit mixed on it when it released. Still though, it felt refreshing because it was just like a regular old school kind of survival horror game you just play through and finish. There are 2 campaigns technically. You can play as the 2 main characters, you know, kind of like a Leon and Claire situation. Definitely not as good. The game definitely has some issues, but if you're just looking for something a little bit different and just like a regular old horror adventure in a spooky mansion, well, Alone in the Dark's got you covered for that at least, maybe if you get it on sale. Next over at number 3, we have Hellblade 2: Senua's Saga. This is a really linear game, and I don't think it's as good as the original Hellblade, I'll say that, but if you are looking for an adventure to just get whisked away in and kind of turn off your brain a little bit, the Hellblade 2 is definitely good for that because it is so tightly linear. There's not really an exploration. You're constantly just pushing forward, and it certainly has its flaws, but it is still a beautiful adventure with some really cool, memorable moments. It's also gory, creepy, and kind of weird, which I certainly don't think is a bad thing. Next, down at number 2, we have something really unique with Tactical Breach Wizards. This recently released game is kind of like a XCOM where you're fantasy wizards. But don't worry, it's actually kind of badass. It's way cooler than you'd think. You're busting into places and taking out enemies in that XCOM turn-based strategy style. You're using cover, you're using the environment, you're using your teammates, all to outwit and defeat these enemies, and it's cool as hell. It's got a little bit of a stylized art style, a little cartoony, but it really can hit. The turn-based tactics thing is always really fun, and this is level-based, so you're playing through it, you're having a good time, and it'll take you about 13, 14 hours. Now down at number 1, we have Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. The single-player campaign for this game is completely linear. You play through an adventure as Dimitri and Titus doing his Space Marine thing, and it's cool as hell. It definitely helps if you play the original game, but either way, this is a good, fun adventure. It gets a little zany, it gets a little video gamey towards the end, but it's a good linear adventure with spectacle, challenge, some cool bosses, and good pacing. One moment you're fighting hordes and hordes of enemies in a massive open battlefield, and then the next you're regrouping with your teammates back at base, and then the next moment you're walking through creepy pitch black hallways waiting for an enemy to strike. There's just a lot of really good moments here, and it's a ton of fun. You can finish it anywhere from like 8 to 10 hours, and it's cool as hell. It's gotten a lot of people into Warhammer 40k, and for good reason. This is just a straight, regular, old-fashioned linear video game campaign. Granted, there's all multiplayer and all that cool stuff, but for the sake of this video, yeah, it's the campaign, baby.